Greetings. My name is Tim Kais, and welcome to God Save the King. God Save the King can be heard on the Truth Be Told radio network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. All you need to do is go to the Truth Be Told radio network, to their website, click on the big listen button, and you can listen to God Save the King, plus a lot of other really great shows that are available on the Truth Be Told radio network. And as soon as I clicked play here, I got a warning message. So pardon me for 1 second while I read this warning message and maybe do a click of my mouse. Da, 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 da. Okay, all right. So Okay, well, all right. Okay, fine. No worries. Okay, so also remember other ways that you can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. You can go to their website. Like I said, go to the Truth Be Told radio network website. That's truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. You can also listen on your Android app. You can listen on MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, and TuneIn radio. Of course, you can listen on Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices, and you can call in on your phone. You call in at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977, and you will be listening to the Truth Be Told radio network on your phone. And as always, please remember that the views of God Save the King are not necessarily the views of the Truth Be Told radio network. So what I want to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is I want to continue in our investigation of the revised chronology of the birth of Jesus Christ. So if you remember, one of the foundational premises of God Save the King is that Jesus of Nazareth was not born on December 25th. And of course, now for some people, that's really shocking. For other people, it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, everybody knows that. What's the big deal? So we're going to explain what we're doing here, because for the people that are shocked, okay, they're going to want to say, well, prove it, okay? Come on, prove. And of course, what they want to say is prove that he wasn't born on December 25th. Well, I don't have to do that. If you believe he was born on December 25th, you have to prove that he was born on December 25th. That is how the rules of evidence work. I'm going to prove he was born on some other date. So I'm splitting hairs here, but my point is that I don't have to disprove that he was born on December 25th, except to prove he was born on another date, that the evidence, the direct evidence, what we would call positive evidence in a court of law, will actually lead you to an alternative conclusion, right? So in our past episodes, we've been talking a lot about the revised chronology of his birth. When was he really born? Well, I believe he was really born on September 11th, 3 BC. Which corresponded to the Hebrew feast of Rosh Hashanah in that particular year. And then it was approximately 15 months later when the Magi would have arrived at the court of Herod the Great, and about a month or two after that is when Herod died. So that is a big part. Those are some big pieces of the puzzle that help us start to put together exactly when Jesus was born. So in one of our previous episodes, we focused in on the reign of Augustus Caesar, because we're told in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Well, Augustus reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. Okay, so you got about a 40-year window there. Then we're also told that in Matthew that Herod and Luke, okay, in both Gospels, that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Well, Herod the Great reigned from 37 BC until his death in 1 BC. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into detail and revisit all of that today. The quote unquote, the most recognized date right now of Herod's BC, I'm choosing my words carefully here. The most recognized date of Herod's death is 4 BC. But that date, I really firmly believe, is incorrect. I believe that when you look at the historical evidence prior to the 19th century, and then the historical evidence that we have dug up since about the mid-1960s, we can demonstrate that Herod died in 1 BC. And the whole point of that is that because of the work of Emil Schur, okay, back in the 19th century, Emil Schur, when he revised the date and said Herod was born in 4 BC, and because that was so uniformly accepted for so long, a lot of scholars and laymen alike limited their search parameters to dates only earlier than 4 BC. So they skipped looking at 3, 2, and 1 BC for the historical and the astronomical evidence of when Jesus was born. And that's a huge mistake. So now that we have evidence that suggests that Herod died in 1 BC, now we have this 3 to 4 year window that we can look at, and we should be looking at, frankly, to determine when precisely Jesus was born. So review, you got Augustus Caesar 27 to 14, you got Herod 37 to 1, okay? So if you take those two and overlap them, you've got a 26-year period of time from 27 BC to 1 BC. You can throw out that 10 years on the back end and the 15 years on the high end. Just get rid of those entirely. And of course, even 26 years is way too much. You can fast forward and get to Herod's margin of error, okay? You can cut through a lot of wasted energy by going directly to Herod's margin of error, and Herod's margin of error is only 2 years. So if we have established that Herod died in approximately January, February of 1 BC. The Magi visited him in December of 2 BC. And if you look at Herod's 2-year margin of error for the slaughter of the innocents, well, that pushes you back to, really only about, at the most, late 4 BC, right? But the reason I call it a margin of error is because I believe that it's exactly that. I believe that the information the Magi gave Herod was really quite accurate, and that Herod added a margin of error on top of that, 6 to 9 months, let's say, to for the babies he was going to kill, for the male children he intended on killing in and around Bethlehem, to make sure, quote unquote, that he got this threat to his throne. But what I want to look at today now, so we're going to move forward, right? So those are our two fundamental parameters, the reign of Augustus and the reign of Herod, right? 26-year period of time, but realistically, you're still really only looking at maybe about a 4-year period of time from 1 BC back to about 5 BC. Sure, you could expand that a little bit to do your due diligence, which I highly recommend, but at the same time, we're already getting this kind of dialed in here. So what I want to do is I want to move on to Luke chapter 2, verse 2, and let's go into depth about this one verse today, okay? Because we've got some great historical indicators in this one verse. There's actually a lot of information here that will help us narrow the field of what it is we're talking about. So Luke chapter 2, verse 2, okay, if we read it from the King James, now I'm doing this deliberately, there are better translations of this verse than the King James Version, but I'm reading it from the King James Version deliberately to illustrate a point, okay? So Luke chapter 2, verse 2 in the King James reads, and this taxation was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So that's how it reads in the King James Version. Now, in the King James, it's spelled Cyrenius. We now know from official Roman records and a better understanding of anglicized Latin that the preferred spelling would be Quirinius. Quirinius, and his full name would have been Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. And we actually know an awful lot about Quirinius from public records. He was a very notable Roman figure, and we're going to get into detail about exactly who he was in just a moment here and why this is actually so cool, because we actually know a lot about this guy, and because we know a lot about him, that is actually going to help us narrow down when he held which offices he held in the Near East for the Roman Empire, which will help us pin down, days and times and stuff like that. But before we even get into the details about who Quirinius was and when he held these offices in the Near East for the Roman Empire, what I want to point out is actually a quotation by N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. So Tom Wright, in his book, which if you don't know who Tom Wright is a preeminent British theologian, extremely popular, extremely intelligent, highly recommend him. He does fantastic work. So he wrote a book called Who Was Jesus in 1992, where he addresses this argument about Quirinius, right? Because here's the deal, right? Luke chapter 2, verse 2, like I said, reads that this taxation, air quotes, if you're not watching me on video, this taxation was held during the time that Quirinius was governor of Syria. And by that, they mean the Roman province of Syria, Roman Syria. That's Luke chapter 2, verse 2. Well, look at, there's several things here that we can use to investigate what's going on. Number one, it calls it a taxation. Okay, is it a taxation? Yes, no, maybe. Okay, we'll get into the detail in a moment, but a taxation, it's in some versions, it's also translated as census. And then in other versions, it's simply translated registration. Because, see, a taxation would include a registration. A census would include a registration, but a registration doesn't necessarily include a census, although that's highly likely, and a registration doesn't necessarily include a taxation. And the reason we bring this up is because the Romans were experts at both taxation and census taking. Okay, and we're going to talk about this in detail. That's the whole point, right? They were experts at these things. And if we look for and they kept pretty good records, all right? So if we look for a taxation or a census in the general time frame that we're talking about here, plus or minus 2 years, it's difficult, if not impossible, to find one. You don't find a standard Roman taxation or a standard Roman census in Judea at this time. So that appears to be really problematic. It makes this verse look like it's got a couple of giant holes in it. Now, the second problem with this verse that, what's the word I want to use? That, cynics point out, right? Critics and cynics point out about this verse is that this verse says that Quirinius was the governor of Roman Syria. Now, Quirinius was the governor of Roman Syria, but he wasn't the governor of Roman Syria at the time, the specific time frame that we're looking at, roughly 234 BC. He was not the governor of Roman Syria at that time. Now, we're going to get into the detail about what he was here in a second, but that makes, see right there, that looks like we've got two gaping holes in this, that there wasn't a taxation about this time, there wasn't a registration about this time, and Quirinius wasn't even governor of Roman Syria at this time. A man named Sentius Saturnius was clearly the governor of Roman Syria during this time frame, right? So, oh my God, the temptation is to say that, Luke must have been a terrible historian. But, the truth is in the details. When we start to take this verse and pull it apart in detail, you're going to see some real differences here. So let's quickly go back to this word for census for a second. So if you look up the word that is translated taxation or the word that is translated census in a critical Greek text, you're going to find out that it's the Greek word apographo. Okay. It is Strong's number 583, if you're that kind of Bible detective or Bible geek. Okay. And apographo simply means a registration, as I was kind of hinting at a minute ago. Okay. It really only means a registration. So while a taxation would include a registration, and while a census would include a registration does not necessarily mean a census, and a registration does not necessarily mean a taxation. So maybe I'm going to suggest maybe we're not looking for the right kind of decree. Okay. See, because that's Luke chapter 2, verse 1. There went out a decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be taxed, right? And then verse 2, and this taxation occurred during the time that Quirinius was governor of Roman Syria, right? So I'm going to suggest, like I said, that maybe we're not looking for the correct type of registration here. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for a taxation. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for a straight up census. Maybe we should be looking for something a little bit different. But I got ahead of myself here. Let me go back to Tom Wright, okay, N.T. Wright, a preeminent British theologian, great scholar, great workman of God's word, right? He wrote in his book, Who Was Jesus?, concerning the question of Quirinius. He writes, the question of Quirinius and his census, he calls it an old chestnut, okay? Air quotes again for those of you that aren't watching me on video. Tom Wright calls this an old chestnut. Now, what does he mean by an old chestnut? An old chestnut is a British colloquialism that means a story or a subject or even a joke that has been repeated so often that it becomes tedious and boring. All right. It's like, oh my God, again, you're bringing this up again. Come on, guys, let's get past this, right? Because as I said, the critics and the cynics love to point to this verse and say, yeah, see, you Bible guys, you don't know what you're talking about. History clearly proves that you are incorrect. So therefore, we have found the fatal flaw in your argument, and now we don't have to pay attention anymore because we found the flaw in your argument. Well, it's actually the other way around. If you do a critical examination of the history, you find out that this verse is amazingly accurate, not the other way around. See, so that's what Tom Wright is referring to when he says, oh, come on, guys, this whole issue of Quirinius and the census, this is an old chestnut, or what the Brits would call an old hoary chestnut, okay? That's their colloquialism for, come on, get over it. Just come on, get on with it. Let's get past this, right? So that's what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this. So like I said, the first detail to mention is the fact that the Greek word for taxation in what would be the King James translation simply means a registration. And I'm going to suggest right now that we're actually looking for a different type of registration, okay? And we're going to get to that in a second. But not necessarily a taxation, not necessarily a census, although the census component makes much more sense than the taxation census, okay? Because one of the things, remember, a couple of the details that we know about this from the same record is that this registration was of such a nature that it required Joseph and Mary, okay? Not just Joseph and Mary. Mary was required as well. She did not go simply because she was married to Joseph. It wasn't because Joe had to go and Mary wanted to go along. It was because Joseph and Mary both had to go. And the reason was, it was because they were going to their ancestral hometown, because they were both of the house and lineage of David. And that is a giant clue because, see, taxation was based on land ownership. Okay. That was the preeminent component. Now, there were others as well, but that was the preeminent component for Roman taxation was you had to be a landowner, right? Because the implication there, which is interesting because this is kind of very biblical wealth is frequently expressed in this manner. When you look at like the Old Testament tithes, plural, for example, there was more than one tithe. Boy, is that another subject for another day. There was more than one tithe in the Old Testament, but not ready. Oh man, am I going to mess some people up here? Not everyone was required to pay the tithe. Okay. So I'm sorry, all you modern ministers that want to say that the tithe is universal and it applies to everyone. No, it does not, because it didn't in the Old Testament. So if it didn't in the Old Testament, there's no way it does in the New Testament. Not to mention the fact the word tithe isn't found in the New Testament, not in the church epistles, that is. We only find it in the Gospels, and then we find it in the book of Hebrews. And then in the book of Hebrews, every time it's used in the book of Hebrews, it's talking about the tithe that Abraham paid to Melchizedek. So you've got to put that in context as well. All right, so that's a rabbit trail. Whoop, let's bring it back here. So similar to the notion of who did and who did not have to pay a tithe under the law of Moses, the Roman taxation was very similar because this was largely an agricultural economy in the world at that time. It was the landowners that had to pay taxes. It was the landowners that had to pay tithes. Why? Because landowners could utilize their land to, here you go, increase their wealth. Now, I should point out, okay, don't misunderstand. In a tithe, okay, because I'm using that as a comparison, not everybody had to pay the tithe. Under the Romans, I assure you, everybody had to pay the tax. I'm not trying to say that no one had to pay the tax. I'm talking about this registration in particular appears to have some peculiar qualities, and this may be one of them, and it bears a resemblance to how tithing worked in the Old Testament, which is that it was the landowners that you focused in on, because it was the landowners who had crops and herds, right? Because that's where your wealth lies, because you can increase your crops, you can increase your herds, right? And therefore you can grow in wealth if you have an agricultural income stream, right? Couldn't necessarily do that if you were maybe a shop owner, or a builder, right? Or something like someone who just did day labor, right? Or here's the perfect distinction. The perfect distinction is, what about the distinction between the owner of the flocks and the hirelings, the shepherds, who simply watched the flocks? Okay? The sheep don't belong to the shepherd who is the hireling who is watching the flock. So why would he have to pay a taxation on the flock? Where the flock owner would have to pay a taxation on the flock, right? So my point here is not to go on this massive rabbit trail about tithing. It's really to talk about the concept of being a landowner, right? And that it's highly probable that Joseph was a landowner, because they're traveling back to their, what's the word I want to use? Their, rats. It's, their hometown, right? But it's their, I'm drawing a blank on the word I want to use. Really sorry about this, guys. This is old age creeping up with people here. Their ancestral hometown. There we go. Got it. Their ancestral hometown. Well, why does that matter? Well, that matters in the Jewish religion, but it also matters if they are a landowner. So once again, see, and I actually planned on getting to the census later in this hour. We're just doing it first. That this registration required, it may not have been a tax at all. Because if it was a tax and Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth, why do they got to go to Bethlehem? What's the point of all that, right? Can't they just go down to City Hall and pay the tax, right? And the Romans didn't necessarily. Sometimes they did. There were times that, clearly, because we read about it in this record, but we also have records from Egypt. Okay, that when the Romans would do a taxation, the people would have to travel. Okay, so we do know that was a common practice, but at the same time, why would you unnecessarily make people travel just to, drop off, 10 shekels at City Hall to pay the tax, right? But my point being is that Joseph and Mary were required to travel. We know they were both of the house and lineage of David, and that they had to travel to their ancestral hometown. So what that suggests is that there was something about this registration that involved either owners and or notable citizens of the Roman provinces or of the client kingdoms. So this was a client kingdom. Okay. So like I said, I actually planned on getting to the census itself, or the registration itself, later in the hour today. I got to it first. So now let's back up and let's talk about this guy, Quirinius. So who was he? Because we are told that he was the governor of Syria, the governor of Roman Syria. And in this case, that does mean the Roman province of Syria. But as I mentioned already, if you go to this basic time frame, there was a man named Saturnius who was clearly the Roman governor of Syria at this time. So what's the problem? Okay, either we're wrong, as the critics have pointed out, or there's something we're not aware of. So the point is that Quirinius had a very notable and unique career. He was well known in the ancient Near East and held a variety of, here you go, what we would call special commands. If you're either in government or in the military and you learn that someone has a special command, that is something that, maybe Caesar himself arranged it directly. Okay. Because he had an honorary office in Antioch, in Pisidia. He also had the guardianship of Gaius Caesar, and he had a bunch of different special commands, right? So when we take a closer look, okay, when we take a closer look at the Greek for this, we read that it's not the usual word for governor that is used here. In other words, it's not the noun form of the word for governor. It's not hegemon. Okay, you've heard the English word hegemony, right? Which means like rulership or authority, or control, right? So it's the Greek word hegemon, right? Hegemon is the noun form, and that's not the word that is used. Is it the adverbial form? No, it's the verb form. It's the verb form hegemonuo, okay, which means it's the act of governing. It's not a title. It's a description. It's an indicating an action, right? So in other words, what Luke is doing here is he's not saying that Quirinius was the governor, air quotes. He's saying that Quirinius was a governor, a governor, right? Someone who governs, someone who operates in authority in that area, right? So if he's simply being referred to as one who governs, then we need more context to discover who Quirinius was and what was he doing. All right. So what we have found, okay, is that there are some historical records that mention Quirinius, right? Okay, so there is actually a fragment, okay, from what is understood to be his own tomb, right? That his tomb has been found in Tivoli Latium, okay? and it's currently in the Vatican Museum, and it reads, ready for this? This is very important because I forgot to mention this. I forgot to mention this already. Luke calls him, the governor of Syria, right? Now we're addressing that right now, okay? Not the governor, a governor, and not at this particular time. See, the funny part is that later on, okay, in roughly 6 AD, Quirinius did become the governor of Roman Syria, right? So that just complicates matters even further. It makes it look like, oh yeah, Luke just got his dates mixed up. Sure, he got the right guy and he got the right title, but man, his dates are like way off because we know that was 8 or 10 years after the time frame we're looking at. Okay. 6 AD, right? So at any rate, there is a fragment from his tomb inscription, okay, in the Vatican Museum that reads, ... was for the second time, the legate of the deified Augustus with pro-praetorian authority in Syria and Phoenicia. Oh my God, that's a lot of really complicated words. What the heck does that mean? Okay, well, what that tells us about Quirinius is, number one, it says he's a legate. Okay, so in Roman governance, a legatus Augusti, was an individual whose title meant he reported directly to Augustus himself. Okay, so just like I indicated a moment ago, okay, he was appointed by Caesar. So that means he's not just a normal provincial governor. This is special status. Okay? So we learned that about him, okay? And that's also what pro-praetorian authority means. He reports directly to Caesar, okay? Now, a second inscription actually appears to clarify matters, right? Now, this isn't an inscription from Quirinius's tomb. This is an inscription from a man named Quintus Aemilius Secundus, who was a prefect in the First Augustan Legion. His tombstone mentions serving under Quirinius. That's the point. He served under Quirinius, who was, Quirinius is described as Caesar's legate in Syria. Okay? So that's really important because so now we have 2 records that tell us that Quirinius was a legatus. Okay? Extremely important that he was a legatus. So his governorship was not standard issue. Not at all, right? And like I said, especially since we're talking about, military matters here, right? This was military governance, right? This was not standard issue. He was, at the very least, a legatus Augusti, and possibly he was what was known as Orienti Praepostus, okay, which simply meant he would have been the commander-in-chief, the CINC, okay, in the Roman East. And that makes complete sense because if he was the CINC in the Roman East, that means he absolutely would have had the appropriate authority to do this, okay, to be the man who was the, what's the word I want to use, the authority. I mean, the decree came from Augustus, but now he's the man who is going to administrate this decree in Roman Syria and the client kingdom of Judea, because even though technically it was different and was controlled by Herod for the Romans, Quirinius would have been the man in Roman Syria, okay, that would have had all the juice to make this happen. And the bottom line is that he was, here you go, at the time in question, this is the office that Quirinius held at that exact time, okay? We do have records that tell us that he was Legatus Augusti from, I forget the exact dates, but it is the time frame in question from roughly, the time frame in question is, between about 4 BC and 1 BC. And at that time, Quirinius definitely did have the kind of authority we are looking for. It would have been perfect. Okay. So it actually lines up extremely well. Now, another component of this, see, is you go all the way back to the quote we started with, right? This taxation was first made, okay, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, let me, I want to try to get something up on the screen here. So bear with me 1 second while I find the my correct screenshot to get up here. Let's go, guys. Come on. There we go. Come on, Mr. Computer. Let's go. All right. So this is the one I want right here. Okay. So let's take a look at this. Let's just get this up on the screen here, guys. Boom. Here we go. Boom, boom. Sorry, folks, my computer's just being really slow here. Okay, so here you go. So let's take a look at this here. So you can look at, so here's the verse. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, right? And my comment here, the Quirinius of the King James Version was a Roman official named Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. His name is known to Christians because he is mentioned in the traditional Christmas story, but we know much more about Quirinius from historical sources than we do from the Bible itself, okay? So this is the Quirinius we're talking about. Let me grab a different screenshot here. Come on, baby. There we go. Sorry, folks. Let's help you out here. Let's take a look at this. Because what I want to point out something. Oh man, yeah, I want to point out something about that particular phraseology, that this taxation was first made. Okay, really, what we're going to get at here. Wow, I'm all locked up here. Oh, okay, come on, Mr. Computer, let's go. All right, share the screen. All right, let's do this, and we want this one. Okay, so now let's look at this one here. Again, some information about Quirinius. All right, here we go. So the one we're looking at now, okay, we're going to look at a couple of different translations of how Luke chapter 2, verse 2 is translated, okay? We got a couple of different translations here because this is something that N.T. Wright points out in his book when he brings this up, right? So look at the King James here, all right? King James is the first reference here up top. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, right? Aha. But now look at how the New International Version reads. It says, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, that's actually a much better translation because what we do know about Quirinius is that when he was the governor of Syria in 6 AD, he did hold a census at that time. See, so it's really easy to look at that and think, oh, that's got to be the one they're talking about. And that's why the critics have such a field day with this, is because no one argues with that. We know that he was governor of Syria at that time and that he did hold a census at that time. But when you read this verse in the Greek, what I've included down here at the bottom is what is really what I consider to be the best phrasing of this, which is, this was the first registration held by Quirinius during his times governing Roman Syria. right? Because that's what's going on here, is that you've got this is a registration while Quirinius was a governor in Roman Syria. So now what I want to do is I actually want to get back to, the details about this registration itself, because as I've been hammering on here, the Greek word apographo means a registration. It does not require it to be a taxation. It does not require it to be a census, although census makes a significant amount of sense, right? That a census would be at least part of the equation. And as we've talked about already, whatever this was, we can see that it required both Joseph and Mary to travel to their ancestral hometown, which suggests that their notoriety, right? Because they were of the house of David. They were royals. They were not only of the tribe of Judah, okay, they were also of the house of David, which made them royalty, okay? And this is stressed in the biblical record, okay? When God speaks to Joseph via an angel in a dream concerning Mary, he says, Joseph, thou son of David. Okay, so this is a big deal. So now what I want to do is I want to jump to a couple of historical quotes that are really going to help us out here. One of these is from or two of these actually. Two of these are actually from the 5th century AD, where an historian named Paulus Orosius mentions this particular registration. Pardon me, got to clear my throat here. Need a cough button for the broadcast here. So let me get this screen up here. Here we go. So now take a look at this. This is a couple of quotes from Paulus Orosius. Look at this from his work. It's called the History Against the Pagans, okay? Or in Latin here, Historiae Adversus Paganos, right? So this is a couple of quotes from Paulus Orosius. He writes, in the same year when Caesar ordered that the first census be taken in each and every province, and that every man be recorded, Christ was therefore born at this time. Okay, so he's mentioning this same registration that we're talking about. This census was the first and clearest statement which marked out Caesar as the Lord of all and the Romans as masters of the world. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a second here. All right, let's read the second part of that quote. It's from the same document. It says, this was the first and greatest census. This was when the first and greatest census was held, when all God's creation of the great nations unanimously swore loyalty to Caesar alone, and at the same time partaking of the census were made into one community, right? And then look at this quote from Josephus in Antiquities, right? When all the people of the Jews gave assurance of their goodwill to Caesar and to the king's government, okay? Because when you look at it's called the Res Gestae of Caesar Augustus, which is when he died, they put this inscription on his tomb and then on these markers all around the Roman Empire. I mean, you can find them. You can find bits and pieces of these things everywhere. In his Res Gestae, it's the achievements of Augustus Caesar. He mentions that it was going to be in 2 BC, right? In early 2 BC at the Feast of Concordia is when he was going to celebrate the 25th year of his reign, right? So 27 BC to 2 BC, the 25th year of his reign. It also coincided with, how old was he? I think it was his 70th birthday, right? 70th birthday. Does that make sense? Don't quote me on that one. Got to double check that. But it was when the Roman Empire, the Senate, was going to bestow upon him the title of Pater Patriae, which means the father of the country, right? So this was a really big deal, and this would have required bestowing such an honor upon him, right? Would have required a registration of all notable citizens in the empire. That means both the provinces and the client kingdoms, quote unquote, swearing their loyalty unto Caesar. So, and when you read the Res Gestae and you pull it apart and examine it, what you discover is that everything, almost everything, not absolutely everything, but almost everything that is mentioned in the Res Gestae of these achievements of Caesar happened before he was bestowed the title father of the country. There's a couple of achievements in the list that are from later, but almost everything happened before he was bestowed with this honor, right? So if you look at the statement from Luke, right, you look at the nature of the registration because of what was required of Joseph and Mary, and now you look at these quotes from Paulus Orosius and from Josephus, these fit. These fit. Now, it may not be the absolute proof that we are hoping for, but this all very clearly points to a registration about this time, okay, that would have required every notable citizen in the provinces and client kingdoms to travel to their hometown to register because they were a notable citizen. So in this case, that means in Judea, it means the royalty of Judea, and that therefore that means the house of David. So I'm very certain this is pointing to a decree that would have went out from Augustus Caesar. Now here you go, prior to him being bestowed with this honor, right? So here we go, because this is a couple of the pieces of the evidence here are etched in stone, quite literally. Okay, that's not just a clever phrase. A couple of these things are literally etched in stone. Caesar was bestowed with this honor in February of 2 BC. Okay, and if this is the registration in question, okay, and it was sent out prior to the bestowing of this honor by the Roman Senate to gather up all these signatures and the oath of loyalty, right, and this consensus by the Roman citizenry, the Roman clients, that they were swearing an oath of loyalty to Augustus Caesar. Well, you know what you would have done is you would have sent that out, about 9 months, something like that, prior to that, which means this decree probably would have went out in the late spring or early summer of 3 BC. Okay? And that makes complete sense. And it fits with Quirinius. Quirinius would have been the legatus Augusti in Roman Syria at the time. He would have been the perfect person to administrate such a census or registration, right? The nature of the census or registration is what would have required Joseph and Mary to travel. All of these pieces fit together. And so what we're looking for here, as I've talked about before, is this absolute proof? No, not quite. I wish it were. I mean, I'm looking forward to the day when we're going to get additional pieces to this puzzle that are going to help us even more, because that's the way historical research works, is that, it may not be an absolutely settled issue right here, right now, at this moment, but you never know what we're going to find out tomorrow. But what we do know is of these various pieces of the puzzle, they do point us in a certain direction, right? Quirinius was a governor in Syria at the correct time. It is highly probable that not only did a decree go out from Augustus Caesar. But this reference here from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and now Paulus Orosius and Josephus, that they are all referring to the same registration because they all have some really significant similarities, right? When you overlap this evidence and look at how they're describing this particular registration, it really sounds like it's the same one. And if it's the same one and it preceded the declaration by the Roman Senate that Caesar, was going to be declared father of the country in early 2 BC, this makes complete sense, and it falls in line with the revised chronology that I am suggesting was the case, okay? That Herod died in early 1 BC, the Magi visited in late 2 BC, Caesar was declared pater patriae in early 2 BC. This decree went out in like the late spring or early summer of 3 BC, which means, and we're going to get into this as well. I can't wait to do this one. So let me plant the seed and tell you guys to look forward to an upcoming episode. In one of our, probably more than one, because it's just going to take the time to do it. In one of our upcoming episodes, we are going to really investigate in detail the what Joseph and Mary's betrothal and nuptials would have looked like, because this would have been a Jewish wedding, not a Western wedding, okay? Not a Western European wedding. This was a Jewish wedding, and because we know what a Jewish wedding would have looked like, we know a lot about what Joseph and Mary's wedding would have looked like. And because we know that, right, I'm going to probably blow you away with some information about when and where and how I think Mary revealed to Joseph that she was pregnant, and that I think that this decree for this registration was really providential for Joseph and Mary, that I believe they were looking to get out of Nazareth, that they wanted to leave Nazareth because they couldn't risk Mary's pregnancy being discovered. Because if she was discovered, that would have been a ginormous mess, So I think they actually intended to leave Nazareth, and that this decree from Augustus Caesar was actually an extraordinary blessing in disguise, because it gave them a reason to leave Nazareth, and that they left and probably weren't even considering really even coming back, or at least not coming back for a while. Now, we know they did. We know they did come back later, but we're going to talk about that more in a future record. So at any rate, my point from today very simply is, if you look at this revised timeline, right, you look at Herod dying in early 1 BC, you look at the Magi arriving in late 2 BC, you look at the decree from the Roman Senate in early 2 BC, you look at the high likelihood from Caesar's res gestae that this decree went out in late spring or early summer of 3 BC. And then and we haven't even gotten to we did it in another episode where we looked at the astronomical evidence. I believe the astronomical evidence tells us that Jesus was born in September of 3 BC. So my point being is that this is an awful lot of indicators that are pointing at the same general time frame. So to put a final point on it here, if you're still trying to defend a December 25th birth date, please show me the biblical and historical records, like the evidence I am presenting to you today, that points you towards December 25th, because I'm sorry, you can't do it. So anyway, really enjoyed sharing this with you guys today. We're going to wrap up. Remember, my name is Tim Keyes. This is God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. Simply go to their website, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. Also, remember, you can listen on your Android app, your MyTuner app, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio, of course, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices. And last but not least, call in at 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 to simply listen to the Truth Be Told Radio Network on your phone. So again, my name is Tim Keyes. Thank you for joining me on God Save the King.